The cowboy caught the little girl who stole his food, but her story broke his heart. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun bled out across the flats, leaving the world in a wash of gray that made every sound feel too close. The cowboy, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles and silent grief, stirred the last of his beans in a blackened pot. He was alone out here by choice. His name was Jedediah, but no one had called him that since his brother was lowered into the ground. Out here, he was just a ghost, and he liked it that way. He was a man who noticed things, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the exact moment a coyote decided he was too close. So when he heard it, a faint scrape of tin on iron, a sound that did not belong to the wilderness, his hand went still. Every muscle in his body locked. His mind cycled through the possibilities. Varmint, stranger, trouble. His heart gave a single hard thud against his ribs. He rose slow, silent, a predator in his own camp. And then he saw her. She was a wisp of a thing, no more than 8 or 9, with hair like tangled straw and a dress made of dirt and desperation. Her bare feet were planted in the dust, and her hands, small and shaking, were deep in his pot, scooping beans into her mouth with a frantic animal hunger. She looked up and their eyes met. And Jed saw the fear. Not the sheepish guilt of a child caught with a hand in the cookie jar. This was raw terror, the kind of fear that meant a wolf was always at her heels. He could run her off, should run her off. A stray child was a magnet for questions, and questions led to people, and people were the one thing he'd ridden 100 miles to escape. But she didn't bolt. She just hunched over the pot, trying to swallow, a pathetic cough racking her tiny frame. She wasn't stealing for fun. She was trying not to die. Something in his chest, a thing he thought had died with his brother, cracked open just a little. He held his hands out, open and slow. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble he hadn't used with another soul in years. She flinched, clutching the beans tighter, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight, as if she was expecting someone else to step out of the darkness, as if he wasn't the real threat. That was the first clue. Jed decided right then. He grabbed a spare tin plate from his saddle roll, filled it to the brim with beans, and set it on the ground near her. Not right in front of her, but close enough. An invitation, not a command. "Yours," he said. For a long second she just stared at him, her breathing ragged. Then, like a spooked deer, she crept forward, snatched the plate, and retreated to the edge of the fire's glow. She ate in gulps, her eyes never leaving his face, watching for the trick. For the moment, the kindness would turn into a trap. He let her eat. The firelight cast their shadows long and dancing against the dirt, 2 lonely figures in a vast, empty world. When she was done, she wiped her mouth on the back of her wrist and looked like she was ready to run again. He saw the scabs on her shins, the holes in her dress that looked more like tears than wear. He'd seen children like this before, in the aftermath of things decent people didn't talk about. He opened his mouth to ask about her folks, but stopped. The story was written all over her. Instead, he pointed to a log near the fire. "Sit." She hesitated, then sank down, pulling her knees to her chest. He grabbed a spare blanket from his mule's pack, shook it out, and offered it to her. She snatched it, wrapping it tight around her shoulders, a tiny fortress against the night. He settled against his wagon wheel, watching her over the flames. He told himself it was just for one night, just until the sun came up. He couldn't let a child freeze to death. That's all this was. But as he banked the fire and laid his bedroll where he could see her, he knew it was a lie. He'd already made a choice he didn't understand. The little girl stayed. And in the cold, dark hours of the night, as the wind whispered secrets through the sagebrush, Jed heard another sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A horse, walking slow, circling his camp just beyond the light. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just listened as the hoofbeats paused, then faded back into the silence. Someone was looking for her, and they were close. The night passed in shards of uneasy sleep. Jed woke twice, his hand on the Colt holstered beside him, listening to the silence. Each time he saw the small, curled shape of the girl by the dying fire, and a strange mix of relief and dread tightened his gut. The hoofprints he'd heard weren't a dream. He'd checked at the first hint of dawn, and they were there, a single horse, shod, walking a wide circle around his camp, watching, waiting. He didn't tell her. When she woke, she sat up with a jolt, her eyes instantly finding him, her body tensed to run. The terror from the night before was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He acted as if nothing was wrong. He set a fresh plate of beans near her, the last of what he had. She ate slower this time, but her back was still bowed, like she expected a blow to come from behind at any second. "Where's home?" he asked, his voice deliberately soft. She looked down at her plate, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she shook her head, a single sharp movement. "Gone," she whispered. He waited. He knew there was more. She looked up then, and her eyes were old, too old for a child. The man with the silver star took it. A sheriff? A lawman? It didn't sit right. Lawmen didn't leave children orphaned and starving in the desert. "He burned it," she added, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He burned it all." A cold knot formed in Jed's stomach. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something dark, something violent, and it was following her. He made a decision. He couldn't leave her here. Whoever was circling his camp would find her the second he rode off. He packed his gear with methodical slowness, letting her watch. Letting her see he wasn't just abandoning her. He showed her how to fill the water skin from the creek, his hands guiding her trembling ones. She followed his instructions to the letter, her eyes constantly flicking back to him, seeking an approval she'd probably never known. When she brought the skin back, mostly full, he gave her a short nod. It was the closest thing to praise she'd had, and a flicker of something, pride maybe, crossed her face before she stamped it out. "You ride," he said, lifting her onto the pack mule. She was light as a bundle of sticks. She clung to the leather straps, her small body rigid as the mule started forward. The trail to his cabin was a long, quiet climb into the foothills. It was his sanctuary, a place no one knew about, a place to hide from the world. Now he was bringing the world's troubles right to his doorstep. He kept his eyes on the horizon, a habit burned into him after an ambush years ago. The road was empty, too empty. The feeling of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He told himself he was just being cautious. But then he saw it. On a high ridge, miles to the south, a lone rider, a silhouette against the morning sun. The rider wasn't moving, just sitting on his horse, watching them. Jed didn't point it out, he didn't change his pace, but he shifted in the saddle, making sure his Colt was loose in its holster. The girl didn't see the rider. Her focus was on the small wooden object she'd pulled from a hidden pocket in her ragged dress. A little bird, crudely carved, its wings half spread. She clutched it in her fist like a prayer. When they finally reached the rise overlooking his cabin, he felt a moment's unease. The small, weathered box had been his fortress. Now, it had a weakness. It had someone inside to protect. He set the rules as soon as they were inside. No wandering after dark. No touching the rifle on the wall. Ask before you take anything. She nodded at each command, her face serious, taking in the laws of this new, strange country. He made a simple meal, aware of her standing by the door, a tiny ghost in his home. "You sleep here tonight," he said. The tension in her shoulders seemed to melt away. For the first time, she stepped closer to the stove, warming her hands. He took an old shirt from a peg, cut it down to her size, and cinched it with a piece of rope. She stood perfectly still, letting him do it, her eyes on the floor. That night, he gave her the cot and took the floor by the door. He lay awake for hours, listening to her steady breathing, the rifle propped against the wall beside him. He thought about the rider on the ridge, the fake silver star, the burned-out farm. This was more than he'd bargained for. He could still take her to the nearest town, leave her with the parson or the sheriff, wash his hands of it. But as the moon rose, casting a pale light through the single window, he saw something glint on the floor beside her cot. She had taken the carving knife from his tool roll. It was tucked just under the edge of her blanket, the blade pointing toward the door. She wasn't just a scared little girl. She was a survivor, and she was ready to fight. Jed realized he wasn't the only one in the cabin keeping watch, and the trouble he'd let in wasn't just following her. It was coming for them both. The morning broke cold and sharp. Jed was up before the sun, his mind replaying the image of the knife. He hadn't taken it from her. Disarming her would be like taking away her teeth. It would break the fragile, unspoken truce they had. He moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, and she shadowed him, a small, silent apprentice. He handed her a bucket. "Creek's down past the trees. Don't spill it." He watched her go, a tiny figure swallowed by the immense landscape. He waited, leaning against the doorframe, every sense on high alert. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded with the night. If anything, it was stronger now, a constant pressure on his skin. She returned, the bucket heavy in her small hands, water sloshing over the rim. He just nodded. Good. He gave her chores, simple things. Sweep the floor, stack the kindling. He watched how she worked. She was clumsy at first, but she was a quick study. She didn't complain. She just did the work, her eyes occasionally flicking to his face, gauging his reaction. She was hungry for order, for routine, for a world that made sense. Late in the afternoon, while they were reinforcing a loose post on the corral, she braced her small body against the wood as he swung the heavy sledgehammer. The first blow made her flinch. The second, she held firm. "Straight enough," he grunted when the post was set. A real, genuine grin flashed across her face before she could hide it. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes for just a second. In that moment, she was just a little girl, not a fugitive. But the moment didn't last. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows from the hills, a rider appeared on the road below. It wasn't the watcher from the ridge. This was someone different. He rode with a purpose, straight towards the cabin. Jed's hand went to his hip. "Inside," he said to the girl, his voice low and urgent. She scrambled into the cabin without a word, her newfound confidence gone, replaced by the familiar ghost of fear. Jed stood his ground in the yard, waiting. The rider pulled up to the fence. He was a townsman by the look of his clothes. A shopkeeper, maybe. His face was slick with sweat and worry. "You Jedediah?" the man asked, his voice shaky. Jed didn't answer. He just stared. "The Sheriff Miller sent me," the man stammered. "He said to tell you he knows what you got. He knows you have the girl." The cold knot in Jed's stomach tightened. The real sheriff. So he was involved. He said the bounty is $500, the townsman blurted out. "For the girl, dead or alive. And he's deputized a posse. They're riding out at sunrise." Jed's blood ran cold. A bounty. On a child. Why? Jed's voice was like grinding stone. The shopkeeper swallowed hard, his eyes darting towards the cabin. "They're saying she's the devil's spawn. They say her whole family were heathens, that she burned her own farm down with her folks inside." The lie was so monstrous, so insane, it took Jed's breath away. This wasn't about a homeless orphan. This was a hunt. They had branded her a monster to justify it. But why? What could this little girl have done or seen to warrant a $500 bounty and a posse at her heels? The shopkeeper leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That ain't the whole of it, Jedediah. The bounty ain't from the town council. It's railroad money. Private. They want her silenced. Railroad money. Suddenly some of the pieces clicked into place. The fake star, the burned farm. This wasn't law. This was business. And this little girl was standing in the way of someone's profits. Tell the sheriff I heard him, Jed said, his voice dangerously calm. The man nodded, relieved, and kicked his horse, eager to be away from the storm that was about to break. He galloped away, leaving Jed alone in the dying light. He turned and walked back to the cabin. The girl was huddled by the cold stove, clutching her wooden bird. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a question she was too terrified to ask. Am I safe here? He knew what he should do. He should ride out, leave her here. Save himself. The man he was a year ago would have done it without a second thought. But looking at her, at the raw courage and terror warring in her small face, he knew he couldn't. He had run from his own ghosts for years, but he wouldn't let this little girl be consumed by hers. He bolted the door. He checked the rifle on the wall, the smooth, worn stock familiar in his hands. He looked over at the girl. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated for a long moment. Lily, she whispered. Well, Lily, he said, his voice flat but firm. Looks like we got company coming. He hadn't just taken in a stray. He had declared war. The silence in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. The word posse hung in the air between them. Lily sat on the edge of the cot, her knuckles white where she gripped the little wooden bird. Jed moved with a cold, deliberate calm, the kind that only comes when you've accepted that a fight is unavoidable. He checked his rifle again, then his Colt, laying out the cartridges on the rough-hewn table. Each metallic click seemed to echo the ticking of a clock counting down to sunrise. He expected her to cry, to fall apart. Most children would. But Lily just watched him, her eyes tracking his every move. He saw the fear, but underneath it, there was something else. A grim resolve. The man with the star, Jed said, not looking at her. He had a mark. Lily's head snapped up. On his hand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A snake, biting its own tail. Jed froze. The Ouroboros. The mark of the Black Creek Gang, a ruthless band of enforcers for hire, known for doing the railroad's dirtiest work. They weren't lawmen or bounty hunters. They were killers. And their leader, a man they called Silas, was famous for wearing a polished silver star, a mockery of the law he so often broke. This changed everything. This wasn't a corrupt sheriff and a greedy railroad agent. This was Silas, a man Jed had a history with, a man who'd been there the day Jed's brother bled out in the dust. His past hadn't just caught up with him. It had found him in the form of a little girl. What did he want? Jed asked, his voice tight. The map, Lily said. Papa's map. Jed turned to face her. Map to what? To the water, she said, her eyes welling up for the first time. He told the railroad where the river went underground. He found the source for the whole valley. It was on our land. He was going to register the claim. That's why... Her voice broke. That's why they burned it all. To get the map and take the water rights. The most valuable thing in this dry, unforgiving country, the wooden bird. Jed looked at the carving in her hand. It wasn't a toy. It was a container. Lily, he said gently. The bird. She looked down at the carving, then back at him. Trust and terror fought a war on her face. Slowly, she held it out. Jed took it. It was lighter than it looked. There was a seam, almost invisible, along the bird's back. He worked his knife into the crack and twisted. The bird split neatly in two. Tucked inside was a small, tightly rolled piece of oilskin. Jed unrolled it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map detailing the creek, the rock formations, and a spot marked with a single bold X. Below it, in neat handwriting, were the legal coordinates of a freshwater spring, a spring that would be worth a fortune to the railroad. It was signed and dated by a federal surveyor. This wasn't just a claim, it was proof. Proof that the railroad was trying to steal federally protected water rights. Proof that would ruin them. This little girl wasn't a witness. She was the evidence. "He thinks I have it," Lily whispered. "Silas, he told Papa he'd be back for it." And now he was coming, with a posse as his cover. Jed looked from the map to the girl. He finally understood the stakes. This wasn't just about saving a child's life. It was about justice. For Lily, for her parents, and for his brother. He slid the map back into its wooden shell and handed it back to her. "Keep this safe. Safer than your own life." She nodded, her expression fiercely determined. The cabin was a trap, a wooden box waiting for a match. They couldn't stay here and wait for the posse. They had to move. Now. "We ride," he said, already pulling supplies from the shelves. "We don't have till sunrise. We have till right now." He grabbed the blanket from her cot and an extra water skin. He worked fast, his movements economical. There was no time to waste. Silas wasn't the kind of man to wait for the sun. He doused the fire, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the window. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and took one last look around the small space that had been his refuge. It was no longer safe. He opened the door a crack and listened. The wind sighed through the pines. An owl hooted in the distance. Nothing. "Stay behind me. No matter what you hear, you don't make a sound. Understand?" Lily nodded, her small hand finding the back of his belt and gripping it tightly. They slipped out into the cold night. The corral was 100 yards away, across an open patch of ground. It was a killing field. They had to be invisible. They moved from shadow to shadow, Jed's boots making no sound on the packed earth. Lily was a phantom behind him, her bare feet silent. They were halfway to the corral when they heard it, the jingle of a harness. Not from the road, from the trees above the cabin. They were already here. Jed pushed Lily down behind a rocky outcropping, his body shielding hers. He peered into the darkness. He could see them now, 3 figures on horseback, moving slowly down the slope, their forms dark shapes against the star-dusted sky. They weren't a posse. They were hunters, closing a trap. And he and Lily had just walked right into the middle of it. Jed drew his Colt, the click of the hammer cocking sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. 3 of them. 1 of him. And a little girl who held the secret to a fortune. The odds were long. Then he saw the glint of polished silver on the lead rider's chest. It was Silas, and he was smiling. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. Trapped. He'd let his anger cloud his judgment, and now they were caught in the open. Silas and his men were moving slowly, methodically, sweeping the area around the cabin. They hadn't been spotted. Not yet. "Don't move," Jed breathed, his mouth next to Lily's ear. She was trembling, but she didn't make a sound. Her grip on his belt was vice-like. He had one chance, an impossible one. Create a diversion, something loud enough and far enough away to draw them off. His mule. The animal was tethered inside the lean-to next to the corral. If he could get to it, spook it, send it crashing off into the woods. It might buy them the few seconds they needed to disappear into the rocky terrain behind them. It was a suicide run, a 50-yard dash across open ground. He looked down at Lily. Her eyes were wide in the darkness, but she was looking at him with a kind of desperate faith. She trusted him. He had to be worthy of it. He squeezed her shoulder once, a silent command to stay put. Then he took a deep breath and broke from cover. He ran, low and fast, a blur in the moonlight. The ground seemed to fly beneath his feet. 10 yards. 20. The air burned in his lungs. He could hear the soft thud of his own boots, a drumbeat of death. A shout cut through the night. There, by the rocks! They'd seen him. A gunshot cracked the silence, the muzzle flash a brilliant, terrifying flower in the dark. The bullet whined past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He poured every ounce of strength he had into reaching the corral. Another shot kicked up dirt at his heels. He could hear the thunder of their horses now as they spurred them into a gallop. He reached the lean-to, a splintering, three-sided structure. He fumbled with the rope tethering the mule, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The mule, panicked by the gunshots, fought against him, its eyes rolling. "Easy, boy, easy," Jed grunted, finally tearing the knot loose. He slapped the mule hard on the rump. "Go!" The animal bolted, crashing through the flimsy corral fence and charging into the woods, just as planned. But Jed had run out of time. As he turned, a figure on a black horse loomed over him. Silas. The moonlight caught the cruel smirk on his face and the silver star on his chest. "Jedediah," Silas said, his voice a smooth, venomous drawl. "I knew you couldn't stay buried forever. Now, where's the girl?" Before Jed could answer, Silas swung the butt of his rifle in a vicious arc. Jed tried to duck, but it was too late. The iron-shod wood connected with his temple. A supernova of white-hot pain exploded behind his eyes. The world tilted sideways, the stars spinning into streaks of light. He hit the ground hard, the taste of blood and dirt filling his mouth. His last conscious thought was of Lily, alone and hiding in the rocks. He had failed. Pain was the first thing Jed knew, a throbbing, relentless drumbeat inside his skull. He drifted back to consciousness slowly, the smell of stale whiskey and sweat filling his nostrils. He tried to move, but his hands were bound tight behind his back. He forced his eyes open. He was in his own cabin. Silas was sitting at the table, calmly cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. One of his men stood by the door, the other was systematically tearing the cabin apart, throwing books and supplies onto the floor. They were looking for the map. "Woke up, did you?" Silas said without looking up. "You're tougher than your brother was. I'll give you that." Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Jed, clearing the fog from his brain. He lunged forward, but the ropes held him fast to the chair he was tied to. Silas chuckled. "Still got that fire. I like it. Now we can do this the easy way, or we can do this my way. And you know my way takes a while. Where is she?" Jed's mind raced. Where was Lily? Had they found her? He scanned the room, his heart pounding. She wasn't there. A tiny spark of hope ignited in his chest. She was still out there. Still hidden. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jed rasped, his throat raw. Silas sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. He stood up and walked over to Jed. "You always were a bad liar." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I know she's here. I tracked her all the way from that burned-out piece of dirt she called home. She's got something that belongs to my employer, a piece of paper, and I'm not leaving without it." He straightened up. "Find her," he ordered his man. "Check the rocks where he left her. She can't have gone far." The man nodded and headed for the door. Panic seized Jed. He couldn't let them find her. "Wait," Jed said. Silas smiled, turning back. "I thought you might see reason." "Let her go," Jed said, his voice strained. "She's just a kid. This is between you and me." Silas's smile vanished. "Oh no, this is about business. She's a loose end, and I don't leave loose ends." He gestured to the door. "Go on." As the henchman stepped outside, a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the night from the hills above. It wasn't a bird. It was a signal. Silas and his man froze. They looked at each other, confused. Then another whistle answered, this one from the woods to the east, and another from the south. They were surrounded. But by what? Silas's face contorted with fury. "Who the hell is out there?" he snarled. He strode to the window, peering into the darkness. Jed felt a surge of confusion and hope. Who was helping them? He had no friends out here, no allies. And then he understood. It wasn't an army. It was Lily. She was using the trick he'd taught her. How to throw your voice, how to mimic bird calls from different locations to make a single person sound like a dozen. He'd taught her as a game, a way to pass the time while they worked. He never imagined she would use it to save his life. She was drawing them out, splitting them up. "It's a trick!" Silas roared, realizing it too. "She's trying to spook us. You two go flush her out. I'll stay here and have a little chat with my old friend." The two men hesitated, then ran out into the night, guns drawn. Silas turned back to Jed, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Clever girl, but not clever enough. Now, you're going to tell me where she hid that map." He picked up a burning piece of kindling from the stove. The end glowed a malevolent orange. "Or we'll see if you scream louder than your brother did." He advanced on Jed, the burning stick held high. The heat washed over Jed's face. He closed his eyes, bracing for the agony. Suddenly the floorboards behind Silas creaked. Silas spun around, surprised. Lily stood there, in the middle of the room. She hadn't been in the hills at all. She'd been under the cabin, hidden in the shallow crawl space Jed had dug for storage. She must have slipped back in while they were distracted. She held the small wooden bird in her outstretched hand. "Here," she said, her voice small but steady. "Take it. Just don't hurt him." Silas's eyes lit up with greedy triumph. He snatched the bird from her hand, forgetting all about Jed. He twisted it open, his thick fingers fumbling with the delicate wood. He pulled out the oilskin and unrolled it, a victorious grin spreading across his face. "Foolish girl," he sneered, looking up from the map. And in that moment, when his eyes were off Jed, Jed acted. He threw his entire body weight backwards, the chair he was tied to crashing to the floor with a splintering crack. The impact jarred every bone in his body, but it did what he wanted. It gave him a direct line of sight to the rifle, still propped against the far wall where the henchman had left it. And lying on the floor, less than 2 feet from his bound hands, was the Bowie knife Silas had been using. It was all happening in seconds. Silas, distracted by the map and the crashing chair, took a half-step toward Jed. "Stay where you are, old man," he growled, but he didn't see the knife. With a surge of adrenaline, Jed rolled, contorting his body, his fingers straining for the handle. He hooked it, dragging it closer. He managed to get a clumsy grip, the blade awkward in his bound hands. "Lily, get down!" he yelled. She dropped to the floor without hesitation. Jed sawed at the ropes around his wrists, the blade biting deep. One strand popped, then another. The rope fell away. He was free. He snatched up the rifle in one fluid motion, rolling onto his stomach and bringing the stock to his shoulder. Silas stared, his victory turning to ash in his mouth. He dropped the map and clawed for the Colt on his hip. He was too slow. Jed fired. The roar of the rifle filled the small cabin, a deafening blast of sound and fury. The bullet took Silas square in the chest, throwing him backwards against the table. He stumbled, his eyes wide with shock, and then crashed to the floor, silent and still. The map lay on the dirt floor, a few feet from his outstretched hand. The silence that followed was absolute. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Jed lay on the floor, the rifle hot in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. From outside, he heard a shout, then the sound of horses galloping away in a panic. Silas's men had heard the shot. They knew the game was up. They were running. It was over. Slowly, Lily crawled out from behind the overturned table. She looked at the body of the man who had haunted her life, then at Jed. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. Jed pushed himself to his feet, his body aching. He walked over and picked up the map. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt. Then he knelt in front of Lily. He didn't know what to say. "Thank you. I'm sorry. You saved my life." None of the words felt big enough, so he just opened his arms. She hesitated for only a second before she launched herself into his embrace, her small arms wrapping around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. She began to sob, not from fear, but from relief. The long, shuddering cries of a child who had finally found a safe place to land. Jed held her tight, his own eyes burning. The emptiness he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by the weight of this small, fierce, incredible child. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian. The first rays of dawn were painting the sky when the real sheriff finally arrived. He found Jed sitting on the porch steps, sipping coffee, with Lily asleep on the cot inside. Silas's body was covered with a blanket in the yard. The sheriff, a weary older man who had clearly been strong-armed by the railroad, took one look at the scene, at the map Jed presented, and at the quiet, unshakable resolve in Jed's eyes, and made a wise decision. He took the body. He took the map as evidence, and he left Jedediah and his new ward in peace. The official report would say Silas was killed resisting arrest. The railroad's claim to the valley's water was dead and buried. Justice had been served, not by the law, but by a lonely man and a brave little girl. In the weeks that followed, the cabin changed. Jed repaired the broken corral fence. He built a real bed for Lily in the corner with a headboard carved in the shape of a soaring bird. Lily planted a small garden by the creek, her green onions pushing up through the dark soil like tiny green promises. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of two people building a life together. One afternoon, they rode into town, not as fugitives, but as residents. People stared, but the whispers were different now. They were of respect, of awe. The story had spread. The woman on the porch, who had once looked at Lily with suspicion, now offered her a freshly baked cookie. Jed went to the courthouse and signed the papers, not for a temporary ward, for a daughter. On the ride home, Lily sat beside him on the wagon bench, clutching the official document. She didn't put it away. She held it the whole way. That night, after supper, she climbed into her new bed. She looked over at Jed, who was stoking the fire. "Jedediah?" she said softly. It was the first time she had used his name. He turned. "Thank you," she said. For the first time in more years than he could count, Jedediah smiled. A real smile, one that reached the lines around his eyes. The ghosts were finally quiet. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. They had both been lost, but in the heart of that vast, unforgiving wilderness, they had found each other. And sometimes, that's all the family you need. If you enjoyed this story and believe that home is something you build, not just something you find, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.